Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 34 is entitled Private John W. Munson and the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion at the action at Mount Zion Church, and relies on his book, Reminiscences of a Mosby Guerrilla, which he published in 1906. John William Munson was born in Richmond, Virginia in 1847, but he does not provide much information about his early childhood. By 1861, he still lived in Richmond and was a member of a cavalry unit called the Governor's Guard. In late April, the governor of Virginia put local militia units on alert, which included the Guards, as it was rumored that the gunboat USS Pawnee was sailing up the James River to attack Richmond, which was at this time just the state capital. At 15 years old, John Munson was too young to be in the rank and file of the Governor's Guard, but he did serve in another capacity of that militia unit. Military companies in those days each had one or two markers, boys who carried little flags and whose duty it was to run out in front of the company to a given point and stand there like statues, while the company marched up to and around them. I went down the river road that Sunday afternoon with the Governor's Guard as a marker, and we slept out of doors for 3 nights for the first time in our lives. The Pawnee did not pass Norfolk, and at last we marched back to Richmond. This was my first soldiering of the war, and I believe it was the first that was done in Virginia. The USS Pawnee was in Norfolk, with orders to blow up the dry dock before it fell into Confederate hands. With 10 guns on board, it could pose a threat to the city, but after it successfully blew up the dry dock on Sunday, 21 April 1861, it returned to Washington, D.C. For 2 years, John Munson remained in Richmond as the war raged across the state of Virginia and beyond, when at the age of 17, he finally decided to enlist. Then it was that we began to hear about Mosby and his men. To my mind, Mosby was the ideal fighting man, from the tip of his plume to the rowel of his spur. Stories of his wonderful achievements came into Richmond from every direction. Joan of Arc never felt the call to go to battle any stronger than I felt to join Mosby. I had not any doubt of my desirability, and figured out that all the partisan ranger required of his men was willingness to get shot, as occasion might require, and sleep out of doors in any kind of weather. John S. Mosby had been in the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry for 2 years and specialized in scouting and raiding under Jeb Stuart. In early 1863, he was authorized to form the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion as partisan rangers that became known as Mosby's Rangers, among other names. As a partisan unit, the 43rd Virginia Cavalry would not be present at the gigantic battles of the Eastern Theater. Its focus would be the supply and communication lines of the Union Army. John Munson discovered that Colonel Mosby and his men operated out of Fauquier County, Virginia, and resolved to leave Richmond to join up, and he did so with a degree of secrecy. John talked about nursing his patriotic zeal in secret, and was concerned with the reaction of his friends if they saw him leave Richmond on horseback. He felt walking out of the city would give his friends the impression that he would soon return. After 10 days and approximately 150 miles of walking, he arrived in Fauquier County and found the house where his hero and his men stayed. Nervously, I swept my eyes over the band in search of a big man with a showy uniform, a flowing plume, and a flashing saber. Gradually, there had come into my mind on my tramp an idea of a figure that seemed to represent Mosby. I associated him in my imagination with Generals Lee and Jackson and Stuart, and I am not sure that I did not liken him to Robin Hood or Richard the Lionheart. He walked up slowly to the building and asked where Mosby was, and he continues, "The shock was something considerable. I beheld a small, plainly attired man, fair of complexion, slight but wiry, standing with his arms behind his back, talking quietly to one of his men. The visions of splendor and magnificence that had filled my mind were swept away. The total absence of visible might, the lack of swagger, the quiet demeanor of the man, all contributed to my astonishment and chagrin. He did not even strut." John Munson ate dinner beside Mosby and his men, and during the meal, the colonel told John that if he could acquire a horse and meet him in the next town, that he could join his cavalry. With horses being in short supply, even in Richmond, this was not an easy feat, but John managed to purchase one on credit from a local farmer and met Colonel Mosby in the next town. I followed Mosby around the room and out on the porch, and, after talking with him for 10 minutes, somewhere or somehow, a pistol came into my possession, with a belt and holster for it, and I was received into the ranks of the Mosby guerrillas, all ready for action. Private Munson enlisted on 10 June 1863 and was initially assigned to Company A, but by 1 October of that year, he transferred to Company B. For over a year, Private Munson rode with the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion, which operated in Northern Virginia, West Virginia, and Maryland. By June 1864, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac settled into siege operations outside of the city of Petersburg, which is south of Richmond. Though stalled in the south, the Shenandoah Valley saw both sides maneuvering for advantage over the other. This included Lieutenant General Jubal Early's corps, which became known as the Army of the Valley. After seeing initial success in the Valley, Lieutenant General Early planned to march into Maryland and eventually on to Washington, D.C. Once Colonel Mosby learned of Lieutenant General Early's intentions, he gathered his Rangers for a raid into Maryland in support of the larger Confederate raid on his own initiative. Private Munson and the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion crossed the Potomac River at Point of Rocks, Maryland, on 3 July 1864, where they made quick work of the small Union garrison. Reaching the Maryland side, we found that the bridge across the canal, meaning the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, had been torn up, but repaired it so the men could cross. We attacked the garrison, drove it out, captured the camp and a lot of stores, destroyed all the government property, burned the freight boat, cut the wires, helped ourselves to everything we could handle, and came back to the Virginia side in safety, bringing our prisoners with us. The raid drew the attention of Major William H. Forbes, who commanded a detachment of the 2nd Massachusetts and 13th New York Cavalry Regiments, who operated in the area. Colonel Charles R. Lowell, Jr., commander of the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, who was not present at the action to come, provided the report for the regiment. Major Forbes rode across several towns on the southern bank of the Potomac in search of the 43rd Virginia Cavalry and asked the local populace of the Confederates' whereabouts. From what I learned from citizens, I think Mosby passed between Leesburg and the Potomac sometime on Tuesday, 5 July. On Wednesday, learned of Major Forbes' second visit to Leesburg and laid an ambush for him at Ball's Mill. While some civilians provided information to Major Forbes as he chased Mosby and his men, Private Munson and the 43rd Virginia Cavalry received similar help. We had about 150 men at this time, for a number had gone back home after the Point of Rocks raid. Undisturbed by the presence of Major Forbes in our vicinity, with no thought of his making an attack on us at night, and with the desire to have it out with him by daylight in a fair field, we followed our leader into Leesburg, where we learned that the Major's command had moved to Aldie. We followed, trying to cut him off at Ball's Mill, but he had already crossed the ford when we arrived, and he was headed for Mount Zion Church. After 3 days of marching and counter-marching, Private Munson and Mosby's Rangers marched by a shorter route to Mount Zion Church and prepared to meet Major Forbes's detachment in battle, just outside of the village of Aldie on 6 July 1864. When we broke into the pike 1.5 miles below Mount Zion, Forbes had not yet come in sight, so we took time to plant our cannon in the middle of the road and arranged to receive him. Presently, Forbes and his 200 men came into view near Mount Zion. The Major did not see us until he got started down the pike again. Our artillery squad, which was more or less afraid of the little 12-pounder, yanked the lanyard, and a shell went howling up the road, only to burst well out of range, without doing the slightest damage. Though in possession of the only artillery piece between both sides, it was the only shot from that cannon. Given Private Munson's description of the gun crew, they lacked proper training and could not maneuver the piece alongside cavalry. In summarizing Major Forbes's leadership, Colonel Lowell could not help but provide critiques of his subordinate. As Major Forbes formed on the south of his advance guard, which had dismounted and fired as Mosby came up, fell back, still keeping a little north of the pike, and took an excellent position somewhat on the flank. Up to this time, I think all the dispositions were admirable. Major Forbes's 2 squadrons were formed, his 3rd squadron and rear guard not formed, but nearly so, and no confusion. As the Union Cavalry formed in line, Private Munson and the 43rd Virginia Cavalry steadily advanced. In order to get at him, we had to move along the road in his front and take the concentrated fire of his men. Mosby ordered us to hold our fire until we could get into the field, and we went along the pike rather leisurely, not giving our horses rein until we got through the gap in the fence. Forbes had not the same idea about where the fight should begin. His men began raking us along the road and were ready with more ammunition when we wheeled and sent up the yell, meaning the rebel yell, which was so much a part of our tactics. Critical to the next few minutes of the battle, the Union cavalry fired upon the Confederates while still mounted, which it seems the horses were unaccustomed. When 2 panels of fence were down, the men trotted through for about 75 yards and came gradually down to a walk, and almost halted. Major Forbes's 1st platoon was ordered to fire with carbines. Here was his first mistake. It created confusion among the horses, and the squadron in the rear added to it by firing a few pistol shots. Had the order been given to draw sabers and charge, the rebels would never have got their gun off, but I think Major Forbes, seeing how uneasy his horses were at the firing, must have intended to dismount some of his men. With horses scared of rifle fire, the Union cavalry became disorganized, which gave Private Munson and the 43rd Virginia Cavalry a critical advantage in their charge. At any rate, we swept into their line like a hurricane, each man with a drawn 6-shooter. At first, Forbes's men made a good fight, but they could not stand the rain of our pistol balls. We split their front rank asunder and broke their spirit. Half of them, in a mad and helpless scramble, got into the next field, where they rallied around Major Forbes and fought as gallantly as men could fight. We crashed into them again, and the battle became a hand-to-hand conflict. Revolvers against sabers and revolvers. Mosby's men discharging their weapons into the very faces of Forbes's troopers. It was a mass of struggling, cursing maniacs, each striving to slay his antagonist. It was only a portion of Mosby's Rangers, Private Munson included, that fiercely engaged with and eventually captured Major Forbes and the remnant of the command that rallied around him. The rest of the Rangers pursued the remaining 2 squadrons that broke in confusion down the pike. The action at Mount Zion Church was one of the most successful engagements of the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion. Private Munson survived the action and continued to serve in the Rangers until he was captured by the 8th Illinois Cavalry at Upperville, Virginia on 29 October 1864. As a prisoner of war, he stayed at the Old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C., where he managed to escape on 27 January 1865. Private Munson returned to Mosby's Rangers and rode with them until the end of the war. John W. Munson wrote Reminiscences of a Mosby Guerrilla in 1906 and took the opportunity to clarify where some of the terms used to describe the 43rd Virginia Cavalry Battalion originated. Our little body of men was called Mosby's Men and Mosby's Command, and was largely due to Mosby himself. He took great pride in speaking of us as my men and my command, but never as my battalion or my troops or my soldiers. The Yankees referred to us, as did also the Northern papers, as guerrillas, in an opprobrious manner, of course, but the term was not applied to us in the South in any general way until after the war, when we had made the name glorious, and in time we became as indifferent to it as the whole South to the word rebel. Thank you for listening to the 34th episode. The link to Private Munson's book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, you will find a picture of Private Munson in the summer of 1863. In 2 weeks' time, Second Lieutenant Camille Baquet of Company A, 1st New Jersey, provides next episode's first-person account at the Battle of the Wilderness. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.